Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Miss Marple and She Died Last Night, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Miss Marple. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Last Light at Greystone Manor. It was a peculiarly still evening in the village of St. Mary Mead, one of those evenings where the air is scented with honeysuckle and the very trees seem to be holding their breath. A silvery dusk had settled over the thatched rooftops, and the winding lanes between the cottages were slowly surrendering to the soft veil of twilight. At the Bluebird tea rooms, Miss Hartnell, stout and formidable in her starched blouse, was collecting the last of the teacups. The scent of warm scones lingered, mingling with the faint tang of lavender polish. Across the lane, the Reverend Pritchard had just locked the church vestry and was seen exchanging a few quiet words with Mrs. Partridge, who was looking unusually pale. All appeared as it always did in St. Mary Mead, tidy, predictable, and faintly smug in its self-assurance. But up on the hill, where the ivy crept thickly along the stone walls of Greystone Manor, a single lamp burned in an upper window long after the others had been extinguished. Miss Marple noticed it naturally. She always noticed things. She had taken her evening stroll, as was her habit, down past the lane, by the vicarage, and back again through the Wild Rose Walk, pausing to nod to old Mr. Sims, who was trimming his hedges with suspicious vigor for a man of 80. It was on her return, as she passed the gap in the hedgerow by Colonel Blount's paddock, that she looked up and saw the light burning. "A bit late for reading," she murmured, more to herself than to her stiff little Pomeranian Muffet, who paused only to sniff disdainfully at a patch of crushed violets. By morning, Mrs. Clement, the housekeeper, found the body. It was Miss Violette Marsh, niece to the recently widowed Lady Agnes Carrington, and known for her rather modern notions and a way of tossing her copper curls as if the world were made, entirely for her amusement. She had arrived at Greystone Manor barely a month earlier from London and had already caused no small amount of discussion in the tea shop. There was the cigarette holder for one thing, and her insistence on breakfasting in her room until noon. She was discovered just before 8, lying across the chaise in the small drawing-room that overlooked the south lawn. A shattered glass lay on the carpet beneath her hand, the dregs of something sharp and citrusy clinging to its rim. Her face was unnaturally still, lips slightly parted. Dr. Hayward was summoned, and after a perfunctory examination, he looked grave. "Poison," he said quietly, avoiding Lady Carrington's ashen face, "though I can't say more until the coroner arrives." By 9:30, the whole village was buzzing. Mrs. Baxter from the post office swore she had seen Miss Marsh in animated conversation with young Mr. Denning only the afternoon before, and that she had looked rather stormy about it, if you ask me. Miss Weatherby, who taught piano to the vicar's children, insisted she'd overheard Lady Carrington speaking sharply to her niece about behavior unbecoming of a young lady not 2 days past, and Mr. Denning himself, poor boy, had gone quite pale and tremulous when Constable Brent came knocking. Miss Marple had received the news from her maid, Edna, who came in quite breathless from the bakery. "Oh, ma'am, the most dreadful thing. They say Miss Marsh has been done in. Dead and right there in the parlor. Poisoned, they're saying. Imagine. Miss Marple did imagine. She folded her embroidery into her lap and regarded the fireplace thoughtfully. Poison, she repeated. So very personal, isn't it? One must be quite sure. By midday, it was understood that the police would be arriving from the county. In the meantime, Inspector Craddock had been telephoned. He was known to Miss Marple and to the village and arrived just before tea time, brushing dust from his trousers and looking, as ever, deeply weary of the world. It seems straightforward at first glance, he said, after speaking with the housekeeper and the butler. But nothing ever is in these old places. Too many rooms, too many motives. Miss Marple invited him to tea, as she always did, and offered him seed cake with a smile. Such a pretty girl, she said thoughtfully. But she had that look, Inspector. You know, the kind of look that invites devotion and loathing in equal measure. It can be quite dangerous in a village. Craddock looked amused. You're thinking of someone, aren't you? I'm thinking of several someones, she said mildly. Lady Carrington, for one, though I don't suppose she'd stoop to anything quite so dramatic. But grief does odd things to people, and jealousy, well, that can be quite untidy. Jealousy? Oh, yes. There's Mr. Denning, of course. She had him quite wrapped around her little finger, I believe. But didn't he used to walk out with the curate's sister, that pretty Lydia? I do recall seeing her crying into a rhododendron bush last week. And then there's old Mr. Pembroke, who was seen giving Miss Marsh a lift in his motor car quite late in the evening. He has a wife at home, bedridden, very proud. Craddock sighed. And I thought this was going to be a quiet case. Miss Marple gave him a prim smile. Oh, Inspector, there is no such thing in St. Mary Mead. Later that evening, as dusk crept once more along the edges of the cottages and the church bell tolled softly in the distance, Miss Marple sat with a notebook open beside her tea tray. She had written down 5 names. She underlined 2. Then, with a small frown, she reached for her copy of Bradshaw's Railway Guide and traced the name of a minor station with her fingertip. She did not look up when the lamplight flickered in the window above. She merely murmured, "It's always the smallest detail that gives it away." And outside, the soft clatter of hooves on cobblestones was swallowed by the deepening quiet of the village, where secrets did not stay buried for long, and Miss Marple was always listening. Chapter 2. Tea for 2 and 1 for the coroner. The Bluebird tea rooms, nestled neatly between the milliner's shop and the village chemist, had always been the heart of St. Mary Mead. With its lace curtains freshly starched each week, delicate floral china that clinked cheerfully with every pour, and the ever-present scent of warm currants and rose-petal jam. It was more than a place for tea. It was the very pulse of the village. It was here, on a Thursday afternoon marked by a light drizzle and the faint tang of freshly turned earth, that Mrs. Dulcie Hargreaves sat waiting. A neatly dressed widow of some repute, Mrs. Hargreaves prided herself on punctuality and well-informed conversation. She checked her watch, a small silver thing with a mother-of-pearl face, and pursed her lips with growing impatience. 3 o'clock, precisely, she murmured, glancing once more toward the door. The person she waited for, Miss Violette Marsh, was not known for punctuality, but it had been she who insisted upon the meeting. A private tea, she'd said, to clear the air. That had piqued Mrs. Hargreaves's curiosity. And now, nearly 20 minutes past the hour, her teacup sat untouched, the milk cooling in its jug, and the crumpets slowly going dry. Outside, The mist curled along the cobbles like something alive, wrapping around boot heels and bicycle tires. Within, the room buzzed with hushed speculation, eyes flicking subtly from table to table. Miss Weatherby and Mrs. Partridge leaned close over their shared teapot, voices barely above a whisper. Miss Hartnell, from her post behind the counter, was clearly listening with one ear while polishing a row of pastry forks. "I suppose she's 2 grand now," said Mrs. Partridge with a sniff. "Ever since she came down from London with her bobbed hair and her silk scarves." "She's certainly turned a few heads," replied Miss Weatherby, eyes flicking toward the window. "Though I dare say not all of them, for the right reasons." At precisely 3:30, Constable Brent entered the tea room, bringing with him a dampness that clung to his shoulders and made the air feel suddenly heavier. He removed his cap and approached Miss Hartnell with a low word, but it was enough. By 4 o'clock, everyone knew. Miss Violette Marsh had not simply forgotten her tea appointment. She had been found by the gardener, Mr. Fisk, face down on the drawing-room chaise at Greystone Manor, lifeless, cold, and with an empty glass beside her. The news spread like marmalade on warm toast, swift and sticky with implication. Miss Marple, seated quietly at the corner table, with her knitting bag on the seat beside her, said nothing. She simply sipped her Darjeeling and watched the room. There were tremors in the conversation that an ordinary eye might miss. Mrs. Hargreaves was visibly shaken, not just at the death, but, Miss Marple thought, at something more intimate. She clutched her handbag a little, too tightly, and her spoon rattled as she stirred her tea. By the following morning, Inspector Craddock had returned to St. Mary Mead and set up in the library at Greystone Manor. The body had been removed, but not the sense of unease. Lady Carrington sat in her stiff-backed chair, swathed in mourning grey, answering questions with the dazed poise of someone whose grief ran deep but carefully channeled. "She was difficult," she said at last, eyes focused not on the inspector, but on a spot just beyond the fireplace. "But she was family, my late husband's brother's child. I did what I could for her." "Did she have enemies, Lady Carrington?" A pause. "She had admirers, and people do take offence when affection is not returned." That much, at least, seemed true. In a single month, Violette Marsh had stirred no fewer than 3 notable gentlemen: Mr. Denning, the solicitor's son; Mr. Pembroke, the older land agent with a tired wife; and even, some suggested, Reverend E. Pritchard's young curate, who had recently taken to composing rather moody sermons. And yet, as Miss Marple later remarked to her nephew, Raymond, over their luncheon, admiration could curdle very quickly into something far more potent. "She flirted, certainly," she said, spreading a modest dab of cress and mustard on her bread, "but not without purpose. That sort of young woman always has a reason. They collect attention like other girls collect postcards." Raymond, who was more interested in the roast chicken, grunted noncommittally. Miss Marple continued, more to herself than to him. "And Mrs. Hargreaves, she was angry, hurt even. Her late husband was much admired, you know. There were whispers, years ago, of an illegitimate child. One never believes those things, of course, but Violette did mention something curious to Mrs. Partridge only last week. Something about setting the record straight." By Monday, Craddock's investigation had turned up little in the way of concrete evidence. The glass bore no fingerprints, scrubbed clean. The decanter from which the drink had presumably come showed no trace of anything suspicious, though the contents had been poured out before the police could intervene. Poison, yes, but where and how? It was Miss Marple who asked a quiet question at the Women's Institute meeting that evening. "Tell me, my dear," she said gently to Miss Hartnell, "was there anything unusual sent to the tea room last Thursday morning? Something not part of the usual delivery?" Miss Hartnell blinked. "Well, only a small parcel, a jar of imported lemon curd addressed to Miss Marsh. I assumed she'd ordered it herself. But Miss Marsh never came for tea that day. And the curd, well, it had been served with the crumpets, hadn't it?" When Miss Marple shared this with Inspector Craddock, his eyes narrowed. "Tea for two," she said softly, but only one walked away. The curd was only on Mrs. Hargreaves' plate. She prepared it herself. But what if it was meant for Miss Marsh, and there was a mix-up? "No mix-up," Miss Marple said. "The packet was addressed to her, but she never touched it. Mrs. Hargreaves, on the other hand, arrived early. Perhaps she tampered with it then. Poisoned something meant for a private tea. But Miss Marsh never made it, so the scene had to be shifted. A glass, a drawing room, something to delay the discovery." Craddock looked at her. "And motive?" "A very old scandal, a name Violette threatened to expose. You see, Mrs. Hargreaves was not merely a widow. She was once, briefly and discreetly, an unacknowledged stepmother. Violette had the proof, and Mrs. Hargreaves could not bear the shame. The arrest was quiet. Mrs. Hargreaves did not protest. She merely nodded and said, "I thought I'd put all that behind me." Miss Marple later remarked to the vicar's wife, "Murder is a very final form of self-preservation, don't you think?" And in St. Mary Mead, the tea rooms reopened the following week, curdless, of course, and the lace curtains fluttered once more in the breeze, as though nothing dreadful had ever happened at all. But Miss Marple knew better. As she poured her tea, she murmured, "It's always the little details, isn't it? Poison in a tea shop. How terribly, terribly English." Chapter 3. A Whisper Beneath the Wisteria. What was overheard in the garden might cost someone their life. It was the sort of golden afternoon that St. Mary Mead excelled in producing, hazy with bees, drowsy with scent, and utterly deceptive in its quiet charm. The gardens of Greystone Manor, though less rigorously tended since the passing of Sir Geoffrey, still held their shape. Gravel walks, winding past early peonies, brick walls clothed in ancient ivy, and on the south side, a long pergola dripping with wisteria in full bloom. The lavender-blue blossoms trembled in the breeze, casting delicate shadows on the flagstones below. Miss Marple had always maintained that gardens were excellent places for overhearing things. People grew careless among roses and forgetful under blossoms. They assumed silence was privacy, and fragrance lent invisibility. It was a common mistake. It was under the wisteria that Miss Marple found the gardener, Mr. Fiske, on her afternoon walk 2 days after Violette Marsh's funeral. He was a lean man with the kind of face that looked permanently sun-weathered, and he touched his cap respectfully as she approached. "You've done wonders with the borders," she said kindly, bending slightly to examine a newly unfurling clematis. Fiske grunted. "Trying my best, ma'am. Not much mood for planting, mind you, after what happened." "Yes," she said softly, straightening. "Shocking. I expect you've been questioned." Constable Brent came round. Asked about the day Miss Marsh died. When I'd last seen her. That sort of thing. Miss Marple nodded. "And had you?" He hesitated. "I did see her that morning, ma'am. About 11 or so. Out here, near the pergola. She was talking to someone, quite low." Miss Marple's eyes brightened ever so slightly. "To whom?" Couldn't say for sure. I was weeding near the greenhouse and didn't want to be seen. But the voice sounded like Mr. Pembroke, the land agent, that clipped sort of way he talks. Indeed, said Miss Marple, almost to herself. The conversation, Fisk admitted, had not lasted long. He'd only caught fragments, indistinct but sharp with tension. You promised? Not here. Someone will hear. Then a sudden silence, followed by Miss Marsh's footsteps hurrying back across the gravel. Miss Marple thanked Mr. Fisk and continued her walk, the information weaving itself carefully into the tapestry she was slowly assembling in her mind. That Violette had secrets was no surprise. That she had confided or threatened someone with them, less so. But that Mr. Pembroke might be involved, that required closer thought. Later that afternoon, she paid a call to the vicarage, ostensibly to deliver some damson preserves. Mrs. Pritchard was only too pleased to pour tea, and the vicar himself joined them with a plate of oat biscuits and a faint look of exhaustion. Poor Lady Carrington, he murmured. She came to see me yesterday in such a state. I fear the girl's death has shaken her profoundly. Miss Marple sipped delicately. No doubt. But I do wonder if it was only grief. Perhaps guilt too. The vicar looked startled. My dear Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting— Oh, not in the way you mean, she said mildly. But families can be complicated. Secrets are rarely buried as deep as people think. Mrs. Pritchard, who had been unusually quiet, leaned forward. I know I shouldn't say so, but I can't help remembering what Lydia told me. Lydia? Our curate's sister. She helps with the flower arrangements at the manor. Said she overheard Mr. Denning and Miss Marsh quarrelling in the rose garden last week. Something about a letter. She said it didn't sound like a lover's quarrel, more businesslike, almost like blackmail. That made 3 people overheard in gardens, Miss Marple thought. One begins to sense a pattern. Back at her cottage, she sat with her, knitting and considered. Mr. Pembroke had a reputation to protect, a fragile marriage, a respected position, and no stomach for scandal. Mr. Denning, young and easily manipulated, had been smitten, then cornered, and Lady Carrington had the weary air of one who had kept too many family secrets for far too long. But it was the detail of the letter that caught Miss Marple's attention. A letter unposted, perhaps, hidden or destroyed. It was always letters in these cases. People forgot that words on paper lasted longer than spoken ones. The following morning, Miss Marple took it upon herself to visit the postmistress under the pretext of inquiring about a parcel of wool. Mrs. Baxter, a small watchful woman with remarkable recall, needed little prompting. Oh yes, Miss Marsh posted quite a few letters, one nearly every day since she came to the village. But the day before she died, she came in and collected one back, said she'd changed her mind. Odd thing. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on the counter. You wouldn't happen to know to whom it was addressed? Wouldn't normally say, Mrs. Baxter said primly, then relented. It was to a solicitor in London, Cartwright and Gray. I remember because my cousin's girl works for them. When Miss Marple asked Inspector Craddock to make quiet inquiries, the answer came quickly. The letter, never posted, was still in Miss Marsh's room. It confirmed what Miss Marple had begun to suspect. Violette had discovered that Mr. Pembroke, once in charge of the Carrington estate accounts, had diverted certain funds. Funds that, had they been known to exist, would have rightfully belonged to her father, and by extension, to her. She had intended to make it known. But she had also told Pembroke, likely under the wisteria where she stood. She was not a blackmailer. she would go through legal channels. She gave him a day to prepare. She never saw the next morning. At Greystone Manor, Miss Marple stood quietly in the drawing room, gazing at the window overlooking the garden. She gave him a chance, she said softly to Craddock. But he couldn't risk it, so he took the letter, doctored the drink, staged a scene. Craddock sighed, and the whisper under the wisteria was a warning, she said. But she didn't realize that he was the one in real danger, from her knowledge, not from any harm she intended. And she always thought gardens were private. Miss Marple shook her head. Wisteria, she murmured, has such delicate flowers. But it's quite strangling, you know, once it takes hold. Outside, in the now cleared garden, the breeze rustled the blossoms, their perfume still drifting sweetly on the air. In St. Mary Mead, even the loveliest things could conceal the most terrible truths. And Miss Marple, as ever, saw through them all. Chapter 4. The clock struck twice at Thornwick Cross. The village of St. Mary Mead had never thought much of Thornwick Cross. It was little more than a broad patch of road at the junction where the main lane forked west toward Market Basing and east toward Chipping Hollis. An ancient stone cross stood there, weathered and lichen-covered, surrounded by a cluster of yew trees that whispered in the wind. A signpost, leaning slightly, bore the faded names of the neighboring parishes. There was no real reason for anyone to stop there, except that Miss Violette Marsh apparently had, according to the vicar. It was a fact that might have passed unremarked if not for a chance remark made over tea at the vicarage, tea which Miss Marple had accepted out of politeness and stayed for out of pure instinct. She passed me on her bicycle just past Thornwick Cross, Reverend Pritchard had said, reaching for the Dundee cake with mild distraction. Must have been 4:15, I'd say. I recall it clearly because the church clock had just chimed the hour and struck again as I stepped over the stile. Miss Marple, who had been darning a pair of gloves for the Harvest Committee raffle, paused mid-stitch. "Struck again?" she asked gently. "Oh, yes," the vicar said with a chuckle. "Silly old thing. It's temperamental in the heat. Sometimes gives out a double chime, minutes apart." "How curious," Miss Marple murmured. "And you're quite certain about the time?" "Absolutely. I had to be back at the vestry for 4:45. I remember thinking I'd just enough time for a turn around the lane before evensong. It was a small detail, so small as to be almost nothing. But for Miss Marple, small things had a way of pointing to larger truths. And if the church clock had struck twice, once at 4, and then again some minutes later, might a witness mistake one chime for the other? Miss Marple took a long walk the next morning, ostensibly to gather, foxglove, leaves for her herbarium, but in reality to trace the route from Thornwick Cross to Greystone Manor on foot. It was, as she suspected, a fair distance, 20 minutes by a brisk walker, perhaps 15 by bicycle. But if Miss Marsh had been seen at Thornwick Cross at 4:15, how could her body have been discovered before 5 and cold to the touch? Inspector Craddock, when she asked him directly, frowned deeply. "We assumed the time of death was shortly after 4, he admitted. "The doctor said she'd likely been dead for over an hour by the time he examined her. Roughly 5:30. That put the time of death between 4 and 1:30. But if she was seen alive after 4, he trailed off, a scowl forming. Miss Marple simply nodded. "You see the difficulty." The vicar was summoned again. He remained certain, but the church clock, when tested, behaved perfectly. It chimed once on the hour and not again. Until, that is, the temperature rose toward mid-afternoon, and the mechanism began its odd habit. A second, ghostly chime, some 7 minutes later. "It's all very irregular," Craddock muttered. "But what does it mean?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She watched the clock, and she remembered something Miss Hartnell had said the previous week at the tea rooms, quite offhand. "Funny, isn't it, how she always wore gloves? Miss Marsh, I mean, even indoors. I thought it must be a fashion from London. But Lady Carrington once told me her hands were terribly scarred. Some kind of childhood accident." Miss Marple had noticed the gloves, of course. What she had not noticed was a watch. "If the church clock struck twice," she said at last, "and the vicar heard the second strike and assumed it was the first, then he may have been off by several minutes, meaning he saw not Miss Marsh at all, but someone else." Someone in a similar outfit? Precisely. Someone who wished to be seen, who wanted a witness to place her somewhere she was not. Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting—" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said gently, "that Lydia Pritchard, the vicar's sister, bore a striking resemblance to Miss Marsh from behind. Slender build, reddish hair, the same habit of cycling with her head turned slightly as if listening to the birds. Quite a bit of opportunity for confusion if one wished to provide an alibi. Why would she? Well, that depends on what Lydia had to lose or to gain." Miss Marple rose and reached for her gloves. "If you would be so good as to have a look in Lydia's desk," she said, "I think you may find the second half of a letter, the one Miss Marsh retrieved from the post office. The first half went missing from her room after her death. I believe Miss Marsh confronted Lydia with it, in the garden, under the wisteria." Craddock, now fully alert, stared at her. "You think she's the one who poisoned her?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Oh, no. That was Mr. Pembroke. He had the motive, the means, and the panic of a guilty man." Craddock blinked. "Then what?" "Miss Marsh threatened to go to the authorities. But first, she sought advice. Lydia, having seen the letter, knew it implicated Pembroke, and perhaps herself, if she had helped conceal the accounts. But rather than stop the murder, she adjusted the timeline." She smiled sadly. "You see, Mr. Pembroke wasn't clever. But Lydia was. By the end of the week, Pembroke was in custody. Lydia had confessed to nothing. She hadn't needed to, but the timing, the placement, the bicycle, the hair, those were enough." "She didn't kill," Miss Marple said quietly to the vicar, who sat ashen in his drawing room, hands clasped. "But she helped conceal a killer's actions. One does not need poison to be part of a murder." Outside, the church clock struck 4. Once, and only once. Miss Marple listened as the echo faded. "Time," she said, "can be a most unreliable witness. But human nature, that rarely lies." Chapter 5. The Lady in the Mulberry Hat. The woman in the mulberry hat first appeared in St. Mary Mead on a Tuesday morning, stepping off the 10:42 from Market Basing with a discreet valise, gloved hands, and a veil that fell just low enough to suggest a preference for privacy. The station master, Mr. Tilley, remarked that she didn't ask for a porter, which was considered odd, especially for a lady of her apparent age and bearing. A well-cut grey travelling suit, slightly too stylish for local fashion, and shoes that gleamed despite the dust of the country roads marked her as not from here. She was seen next at the post office, then at the Bluebird tea rooms, where Miss Hartnell noted, after she had gone, that she had ordered only a single pot of Ceylon and declined both the fruit scone and the seed cake. She barely touched her tea Miss Hartnell said, polishing a teacup vigorously, and she sat facing the window, but she wasn't looking out of it. You mark my words, Miss Marple. That woman was listening. Miss Marple, who had been quietly threading her needle through a patch of linen, merely nodded. People who listen often have something to hear. By mid-afternoon, the woman had taken up residence at the King's Head Inn, a modest but clean establishment overlooking the green, where the flower beds were newly turned and the hens from Mrs. Gryce's cottage occasionally wandered too near the benches. She gave her name as Mrs. Millicent Grey, and though her manners were impeccable, she offered no details of where she'd come from or for how long she intended to stay. The landlady, Mrs. Pratt, assured anyone who asked that she paid in advance and requested a room with a view, not of the green, curiously, but of the churchyard. Miss Marple was naturally intrigued. Not 3 days had passed since the arrest of Mr. Pembroke for the murder of Violette Marsh, and though the village had made a collective effort to return to the rhythms of its daily life, Mrs. Partridge had even resumed her embroidery circle, the appearance of Mrs. Grey stirred up unease like a spoon in clotted cream. "She's come to poke about," muttered Colonel Blount at the shop. "A journalist, I'll wager. They're all after scandal these days." "No," replied Mrs. Price Ridley, her voice clipped. "A relation. Bound to be. That girl, Violette, had all sorts of connections in London, artists and such. They come out of the woodwork when there's money involved." Miss Marple, however, had a different suspicion altogether, and it began to take shape when she saw Mrs. Grey walking through the churchyard one morning, pausing not at the Carrington family tomb, but at the newer, plainer graves, those without names, just numbers and dates. "She walks like a woman who knows sorrow," Miss Marple said quietly to herself, "but also like one who has been taught to hide it." The question remained, what was she doing in Mary Mead, and why now? It was the following day, after morning prayers, that Reverend Pritchard confided in Miss Marple that Mrs. Grey had requested a meeting with him. She had questions, he said, frowning, about Violette Marsh, about the burial. Rather pointed questions, too. Asked whether the body had been viewed publicly. It hadn't, of course, for obvious reasons. Lady Carrington requested a closed casket, a private service. Miss Marple's knitting paused, then resumed. "And how did she take that?" "She asked." The vicar's brow creased further. "She said something peculiar. She said, 'Then there's still a chance you buried the wrong girl.'" By that evening, Mrs. Grey was gone. She left as quietly as she had come, slipping away on the early train before most of the village had stirred. Mrs. Pratt found her key on the dresser and a note thanking her for the hospitality. But what she left behind was not just her room or her tea unfinished. It was uncertainty. Miss Marple, who had seen her boarding the train from her garden gate, thought deeply for the better part of the day. Then, with a purposeful air, she donned her best gloves and walked to the police station. "I wonder, Inspector Craddock," she said, "if you've quite satisfied yourself that the young woman buried under the name of Miss Violette Marsh is in fact who she claimed to be." Craddock, who had by now come to respect the tone Miss Marple used in such moments, looked up sharply. "You think she wasn't?" Miss Marple sat primly. "I think Mrs. Grey was not merely a passer-by. I think she recognized something no one else did, or at least feared it. A resemblance, perhaps, or the absence of one." Craddock frowned. "She wasn't family. There's no record of her." "She may not have been family by blood," Miss Marple said gently, "but perhaps by association. A governess, a nurse, someone who knew Miss Marsh as a child. before the accident that scarred her hands. You recall the gloves, Inspector? I do. I also recall that no one had seen Violette in many years before her arrival. She came recommended by a cousin, now conveniently abroad. Letters were her introduction. But the woman who arrived, vivacious, cunning, charming, was never seen in the company of those who had known her in youth. You think she was an impostor? I think, said Miss Marple, that a woman took another's place, and that the real Violette may already have been dead. Craddock leaned back, slowly. Then the man we've arrested may have killed the wrong woman. Or the right one, for the wrong reason. The mystery deepened, but the villagers knew none of this. They only knew that Mrs. Millicent Grey had come and gone, that she had spoken little and asked much, and that her shadow lingered. At the Bluebird tea rooms, the chair by the window remained empty for days, and Miss Marple, as she pruned her rose bushes, thought quietly, she arrived without fanfare, but she left behind the question that may yet unravel everything. Chapter 6. Portents and Pudding at the Harvest Fete, a Cryptic Fortune and a Ruined Dessert. Both warning signs, if one knew how to read them. The annual Harvest Fete in St. Mary Mead had, for as long as anyone could remember, been held on the first Saturday of October. It was the sort of event that brought out the entire village, farmhands and vicars, widows and housemaids, each in their autumn best, gathering beneath buntings strung from tree to tree like a cheerful net. The fete was held in the meadow behind the vicarage, where tables groaned under the weight of Victoria sponges, marrow pickles, and hand-knitted tea cozies, and the air was tinged with hay, cinnamon, and the scent of chrysanthemums just past their prime. Miss Marple, though no longer sprightly enough to oversee the tombola, still made her annual contribution in the form of a modest display of hand-embroidered linen sachets and a rather splendid plum jam that had won a ribbon 3 years running. She arrived shortly after 2, wearing a dove-grey shawl and a practical hat, her eyes alert beneath their genteel blue veil. The fate, however, was not to unfold with the harmless predictability expected of it. It began, innocuously enough, at the fortune-telling tent. Madame Zuleika, known to the Women's Institute as Mildred Hatch from Upper Downham, had once spent a week in Bournemouth and returned convinced of her mystic gifts. Draped in bangles and lace, she sat at a small table behind, a curtain of rustling beads, peering theatrically into a crystal ball while occasionally consulting a set of slightly worn tarot cards. To most, it was good-natured nonsense. You'll meet a tall, dark stranger, and a change of residence is in your stars. But to the young Mr. Denning, solicitor's son, and once smitten admirer of the late Violette Marsh, the fortune was neither vague nor benign. You are watched, Madame Zuleika said, her fingers tightening on his wrist. Something from your past will be uncovered, and when the mask slips, the blood will flow again. Mr. Denning, pale and visibly shaken, left the tent at once and walked straight into a table of slow gin entries, much to Mrs. Price Ridley's dismay. Miss Marple, who had seen it all from her vantage near the sponge cakes, narrowed her eyes and quietly excused herself from a conversation about winter preserves. But it was not until the pudding disaster that the real stir began. The centerpiece of the fete was always the harvest pudding competition, an event taken with solemn seriousness by the older ladies of the village. This year's entries had been displayed with great ceremony in the marquee, and the judging was due to begin at 4. There were 5 puddings in total, each more traditional than the last. sweet and treacle, brandied plum, and one particularly beautiful spotted dick presented by Miss Hartnell herself. And yet when the marquee flap was opened and the puddings unveiled, it was clear something had gone terribly wrong. Miss Hartnell's pudding, so carefully prepared the night before and guarded with near-military vigilance, was oozing. Its once firm edges had collapsed into a puddle of sticky goo, its center streaked with a strange purplish hue. Gasps broke out from the assembled villagers. Mrs. Partridge actually put a hand to her mouth. "It's been tampered with," Miss Hartnell cried, crimson with indignation. "Sabotaged." Miss Marple stepped forward, peering at the dessert with a measured expression. She dipped the tip of a spoon into the liquefied mess, sniffed, and looked thoughtful. "Not brandy," she said quietly. "Cordial. Damson, perhaps." Inspector Craddock, who had been in attendance largely for appearance's sake, and possibly the fruit loaf, arrived with brisk authority. He knelt beside the ruined pudding, examined the surrounding table, and rose with a frown. "Miss Hartnell," he said, "are you certain this is your pudding?" "Of course I am," she snapped. "I tied a green ribbon round the basin. I checked it myself not half an hour ago. And then I went to see the lace entries with Mrs. Price Ridley. You may ask her." "She did," Mrs. Price Ridley confirmed from behind a voluminous ostrich feather hat. "Though I should not be brought into this." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Mr. Denning, who stood alone beneath the hawthorn tree, rubbing his temples as if in pain. "Sabotage is a very specific act," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "It requires knowledge and intent." She took a turn through the fete, stopping to admire the flower displays, exchanging pleasantries with old Mr. Sims, and at last arriving at the fortune-telling tent. Madame Zuleika sat alone, packing away her cards. "May I have a word, Mildred?" Madame Zuleika looked up sharply, then deflated. "Oh, it's you, Miss Marple." "I believe," said Miss Marple, "you told young Mr. Denning something rather upsetting." Mildred looked uncomfortable. "I didn't mean to frighten him, but he seemed on edge. He asked if I could see anything dangerous in his future. He was trembling like a leaf." Miss Marple nodded. "And you said something about the mask slipping." "I did," Mildred admitted, "because he dropped a photograph while taking out his handkerchief. A woman. It wasn't Miss Marsh, though. It was someone older. Looked a bit like her, but different." "Different how?" "Sterner. Cold eyes, like someone who'd had a hard life." Miss Marple returned to her garden that evening with a sense of something tightening. The pudding, she was certain, was not the crime, but the warning. It had been meant to draw attention. The color, the collapse. It mimicked the symptoms of poisoning, but in harmless form. Someone, she thought, wanted to frighten Mr. Denning. And someone else had sent a message the only way they knew how. The next morning, the vicar's wife stopped by, with a leftover jam tart and a curious look. "Did you hear? Mr. Denning left last night, on the last train. Said he had urgent business in London." Miss Marple accepted the tart with thanks. "Curious," she said softly, "but not entirely unexpected." She looked down at her gardening gloves and thought of fortunes and puddings, of veiled threats, and the curious arrival of Mrs. Gray. And she knew, as surely as she knew her hydrangeas would turn blue next spring, that the fate had not simply been a village gathering. It had been a reckoning. Chapter 7. An empty bed and a letter unsent. What was meant to be said, and why it was never posted, holds the key. There are few sights more telling, thought Miss Marple, than a bed that has not been slept in. Not untidied or sloppily made, but untouched. pristine sheets, uncreased pillows, the careful lay of a counterpane undisturbed. It is the kind of absence that suggests either an early departure or something far more sinister. The room in question belonged to Miss Violette Marsh. It was situated on the east side of Greystone Manor, with a narrow balcony overlooking the yew maze, and a view, on clear days, of the spire of St. Mary Mead's Church. The room had been locked since the day of her death, on Lady Carrington's request, and out of what she described as a sense of decency and mourning. But with Inspector Craddock's investigation taking an unexpected turn, and Miss Marple's quiet urging behind the scenes, the room was at last opened again. Craddock had agreed, albeit reluctantly. "What are we looking for exactly?" he'd asked, watching Miss Marple enter the room with her usual serene deliberateness. "Not what, dear Inspector," she replied gently. "Why?" The room was neat, almost too neat. The dressing table gleamed with polish, a few bottles of scent, and a compact laid out as if in preparation for display. The wardrobe contained a modest but fashionable selection of dresses, London tailoring with village restraint, and on the writing desk by the window stood a small stack of stationery, ivory-coloured and embossed with a simple monogram, V.M. Miss Marple crossed to the bed, brushing her fingers lightly across the untouched linen. "She didn't sleep here that night," she murmured. Craddock glanced up. "So where did she go?" "Somewhere she thought she'd be safe, or somewhere she thought she'd only be a moment." Miss Marple turned to the desk, opening the top drawer with care. Inside were the usual tokens of a young woman's habits: a sealed bottle of ink, several addressed but empty envelopes, a gold fountain pen, and tucked at the back, beneath a folder of pressed violets, a single sheet of folded writing paper. Miss Marple drew it out, opened it carefully, and read in silence. "Well?" Craddock asked. "She was trying to do the right thing," Miss Marple said softly, but she hesitated. The letter was dated the morning before her death. It was addressed to a solicitor in London, Mr. Cartwright, the same. Name previously found on an envelope retrieved from the village post office. But this letter had never been sent. The ink had dried. The sheet had been folded, perhaps to be posted later, but it never was. She handed it to Craddock, who read aloud, "Dear Mr. Cartwright, I have resolved at last to make everything known. I fear I have let my position here go on too long under false pretenses. The matter regarding the late Sir Geoffrey's estate is more complicated than I had understood, and I believe a full audit is warranted. I enclose a copy of the accounts I recovered, though I suspect there are others. Mr. Pembroke is not to be trusted. Yours sincerely, Violette Marsh." Craddock looked up. She had evidence. "She found evidence," Miss Marple corrected, "and she intended to act. But she never posted the letter. Why? Fear. Perhaps, or perhaps—" She crossed slowly to the fireplace. She was stopped. Craddock followed her gaze. On the mantelpiece sat a clock, elegant, brass-edged, and chiming. Beneath it was a small pile of ash, barely visible unless one looked closely. "Something was burned here," Miss Marple said. "Something small, perhaps a letter, but not this one." Craddock frowned. "So she wrote a letter and destroyed another?" "I believe she wrote two," said Miss Marple. "One to the solicitor, and one to someone else." Craddock looked puzzled. "Who?" Miss Marple bent to examine the wastebasket beneath the desk. It had been emptied, save for a curled fragment of charred paper at the bottom. She took a pair of tweezers from her handbag, a habit formed over years of village emergencies and stray embroidery threads, and gently retrieved it. The corner of the page bore a single, elegant loop of handwriting, a capital L. Lady Carrington, Miss Marple said. She was going to warn her aunt, or confront her, and then she changed her mind. Craddock sat back. So, you think Lady Carrington knew? I think, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, that she suspected, and I think she kept this room locked, not out of mourning, but out of guilt. Not for the crime itself, but for the part she played in allowing it. And the empty bed? She went to speak with someone that night, perhaps Mr. Pembroke, perhaps Lady Carrington, perhaps someone else entirely. Craddock considered. Then the question is, why did she never return? Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. Because she realized too, late, that someone she trusted was not as trustworthy as she believed. She took the letter to confront them, thinking perhaps she could reason with them. But the letter was destroyed, and she was silenced before she could post the other. Which means, Craddock said slowly, the person who killed her knew about both letters and feared what they would reveal. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Exactly. It was late afternoon when they left the room. The sun slanted across the churchyard. Below, lighting the autumn leaves in brief golden fire. The village appeared peaceful, as it always did. But somewhere, within its hedges and prim gardens, a murderer still moved with practiced ease. And Miss Marple, with a letter never posted and a bed never slept in, was closer than ever to knowing who that murderer was. Chapter 8. The third stair from the top. Miss Marple notices what everyone else stepped over. The great staircase at Greystone Manor was, in its own quiet way, rather impressive. Crafted from dark oak and polished to a glossy sheen, it curved upward from the main hall with the sort of restrained grandeur that never quite shouted for attention, but suggested money well-rooted and tastes firmly entrenched in the Edwardian era. Visitors often remarked on the grandfather clock at the E landing or the oil portrait of Sir Geoffrey in his younger, more rakish days. What they never remarked upon was the staircase itself, and that, thought Miss Marple, was exactly the trouble. It was just past 11 in the morning when she returned to Greystone Manor at the invitation of Lady Carrington, an invitation which had come, it seemed, not from warmth, but from a pressing sense of discomfort. Something had begun to unravel in the household, and Miss Marple had learned to recognize that peculiar flurried tone that came from those on the edge of revealing something they had long tried to suppress. "Do sit down, Miss Marple," Lady Carrington had said, motioning toward a damask chair in the drawing-room, her fingers twisting a lace-edged handkerchief. "I've been reflecting on certain events, and I wonder whether I've made a dreadful mistake." Miss Marple, serene as ever, simply nodded. "Most of us do, eventually. I mean regarding Violette, her identity. I believe the question is not whether you made a mistake, Lady Carrington," said Miss Marple gently, "but whether someone else took advantage of one." Lady Carrington blanched, and her eyes darted, guiltily Miss Marple thought, to the hallway beyond the drawing-room door. She said nothing, and after a strained silence, Miss Marple took her leave, saying she might have a small walk round the house before returning to the village. She did not, in fact, walk out. She walked up. The upper floors of Greystone were quiet, muffled with the hush of thick carpets and thick secrets. She passed the door to Miss Marsh's bedroom, now locked again on Craddock's orders, and moved toward the guest corridor. The house had been full once. Visitors from London, friends of Sir Geoffrey, even a minor baronet's daughter, rumoured to have had an eye on the late master of the house. But now it was mostly silence and closed doors. She was halfway down the stairs, lost in thought, when her foot caught ever so slightly. Not a stumble, Miss Marple did not stumble, but enough of a shift to make her stop. The third stair from the top. She stepped back, looked down, and pressed her foot again. It gave a little more than the others, a softness, not quite visible, but distinct to the sensitive foot of one who had once spent a season in Bath and learned to recognize a loose floorboard at 50 paces. She bent, fumbled delicately at the edge, and felt a thin sliver of air beneath the riser. The stair lifted, only an inch or so, but enough to suggest it had once been designed, cleverly and quietly, to open. She glanced around. No one in sight. Miss Marple, despite the years, was still nimble-fingered when it mattered. She pressed again, this time using the corner of her compact mirror, and the stair lifted with a soft creak. Inside, nestled in a shallow recess, was a single object, a lipstick. Not a modern one with a metallic case and a factory label, but an old-fashioned silver tube, chased with delicate filigree and the faintest engraving of initials, E.H. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She had heard that name before, Edith Hargreaves, the woman Violette Marsh had arranged to meet for tea, and who had been so curiously shaken when Miss Marsh failed to arrive. A woman known for discretion and taste, and not, Miss Marple recalled, for scarlet lipstick. And yet the colour, even now, was vibrant, crimson, with a slightly bluish tint, just like the mark Inspector Craddock had noted on the rim of the poisoned glass. Miss Marple closed the stair, her heart ticking steadily in her chest. Back in the drawing-room, she found Lady Carrington pacing. "Lady Carrington," she said softly, "might I ask, was Miss Marsh the first woman to stay in that upstairs room since the passing of your late husband?" Lady Carrington blinked. Yes. That is, yes, I believe so." "And was Mrs. Hargreaves ever known to visit the manor at any time, even long ago?" A pause. "I suppose, yes. She came once or twice. She and Geoffrey were, well, before me, of course." "I see," said Miss Marple. "And did she perhaps leave something behind? A memento?" Lady Carrington looked up sharply. "What are you implying?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that the lipstick belonged to her. I think Miss Marsh found it, or something else connected to her. And I think she confronted Mrs. Hargreaves at tea, perhaps. She may even have threatened to reveal something not about money or inheritance, but identity." Miss Marple's voice dropped. "I think Miss Marsh discovered she wasn't Violette Marsh at all." Lady Carrington clutched the chair. "Oh, dear God." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Two women, both young, both from troubled families. An opportunity to assume a new name. A village that had never seen the real Violette since childhood. A fortune, yes, but also safety, escape. And then the real secret, that it was not Edith Hargreaves who sought to silence the imposter, but the imposter who tried to silence Edith. Only something went wrong, someone else got involved, and in the end, the lipstick gave it away. Craddock arrived not an hour later. Miss Marple handed him the lipstick and explained what the third stair had revealed. "It's always stairs, you know," she said. "People hide things in staircases as if the passing of feet makes them invisible." And the case, at last, began to unwind. The imposter, calling herself Violette Marsh, had discovered the truth too late. That the real Violette had died in obscurity, and that someone still living remembered her well enough to raise questions. Mrs. Hargreaves had threatened exposure. The poison tea was prepared, but it was the lipstick, concealed long ago and forgotten, that proved her undoing. Everyone else had stepped over it, but Miss Marple had noticed. Chapter 9. Ashes in the drawing-room grate. Something was burned in haste, something worth killing for. There was a faint chill in the air, the sort of brittle morning crispness that hinted at the end of autumn. A curling mist still clung to the hedgerows, and the lanes of St. Mary Mead were dusted with a layer of dew that turned every leaf into a shard of glass. In the drawing-room at Greystone Manor, the fire had already been lit, though it sputtered with a damp reluctance. Miss Marple stood just within the doorway, her gloved hands folded neatly before her, her gaze fixed, not on the portrait of Sir Geoffrey above the mantel, nor on the polished ormolu clock that ticked steadily onward, but on the grate. It was not an uncommon sight, a fire laid to take the edge off the morning. Yet something caught the eye, a discoloration in the ash, a warped sliver of blackened paper, nestled like a secret among the cinders. She took a slow step closer. "You've been busy this morning," she murmured, as much to the fireplace as to the butler, who stood stiffly in the doorway behind her. "Lady Carrington asked that the fire be made up, madam," he said. "The drawing-room had gone quite damp overnight." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and yet the air smells of something acrid, not simply wood smoke." She knelt, drawing a brass poker from its stand, and gently stirred the ash. A few charred fragments shifted, fluttering like wounded birds. There, just the edge of a wax seal, half melted, pressed into what remained of an envelope. Miss Marple delicately retrieved it with a silver teaspoon from the tray. Behind her, Inspector Craddock entered, summoned at her request earlier that morning. "Well?" he asked, watching her examine the fragment under the window's pale light. "I think," she said, "this was what Violette, the woman calling herself Violette, was carrying when she disappeared from her bedroom that night. The second letter, the one we suspected she wrote but never found." Craddock approached, taking the blackened scrap gently between his fingers. "This was burned recently." Miss Marple nodded. "The edges are crisp, the ash undisturbed. Someone disposed of it after the fact, perhaps when the rest of the house was asleep." "Who?" Craddock asked. "And why wait until now?" "Because someone thought it was safely hidden. And then they realized the other letter had been found." She turned and looked toward the tall bookcase near the window, her eyes fixed on a particular shelf, the middle one, where the leather-bound volumes of Tales of the Empire rested undisturbed. "The envelope was sealed, Inspector," she said, "and the paper burned hastily, not slowly. That suggests panic. Someone found it, perhaps yesterday, perhaps early this morning, and realized what it might reveal." Craddock stared at the grate. "But what did it reveal?" "That," said Miss Marple gently, "is the question, and I think I can answer it." She crossed to the writing desk, where a blotter still bore faint impressions. She pressed a sheet of thin tissue over it, rubbed gently with a graphite pencil, and watched as letters appeared like ghosts. "Not Violette. She died in Sussex. I was there." She looked up at Craddock. "The real Violette Marsh died 4 years ago. The woman who arrived here impersonated her, but she made the mistake of contacting someone who had once known the real girl. She thought she could control the story. But that letter, this one, here in the ashes, was the beginning of a confession." Craddock's face darkened. "And someone killed her to keep that from surfacing." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but not only for the money. There's something deeper. Someone helped her take that identity. not just for gain, but out of guilt. Craddock's eyes narrowed. Lady Carrington? No. She turned a blind eye, perhaps, but she was not involved from the start. Miss Marple turned again to the fireplace. The handwriting on the envelope. It matches Mrs. Hargreaves. I noticed it at the fete, on the jam labels. A distinct curl to the R, and the looped descender on the G. I believe it was she who helped falsify the identity. Perhaps to shield the girl, or to shield herself. Either way, when the letter turned up, when the woman who had assumed the name of Violette tried to absolve herself and tell the truth, Mrs. Hargreaves panicked and silenced her. Perhaps not directly, Miss Marple said. She may have prepared the poison, but I suspect it was someone else who delivered it. She simply allowed it. And later, when the letter resurfaced, when the ashes of the past threatened to reignite, she burned it, but not well enough. Craddock looked long at Miss Marple, then at the grate. I've been chasing missing statements, false names, and altered accounts, he said. But you followed the ash. She smiled faintly. Ashes, Inspector, are very revealing. What we try to destroy says more about us than what we choose to keep. The drawing room seemed suddenly cold again, though the fire still glowed. Outside, a wind had picked up, rustling the ivy against the tall windows of Greystone Manor. It was the sort of sound that suggested change, the past shifting its weight, secrets beginning to dislodge. Miss Marple turned toward the door. It's nearly over, she said. But not quite. There's still one more truth to uncover. She glanced once more at the ashes, then at Craddock. Let's see what the Morning Post brings. I believe it's time someone else received a letter of their own. Chapter 10. The Truth, at 4:45. Miss Marple rings for tea, and then she reveals everything. It was a fine afternoon in St. Mary Mead, one of those deceptively gentle English days where the sun filtered through lace-curtained parlor windows and the sound of distant hedge trimming mingled with the chime of church bells. The village had begun, as it always did, to resume its quiet rhythm, as if the events of the past weeks were no more than a draught that had passed under the door and been promptly swept away. But Miss Marple knew better. At precisely 4:15, the old ormolu clock on her parlor mantel gave its single, solemn chime. Miss Marple, seated in her usual chair by the fireplace, reached for the silver bell on the side table and gave it a soft ring. Edna, the maid, appeared a moment later with a tray of tea, 2 cups, a fresh pot of Darjeeling, and a modest plate of walnut biscuits. Thank you, Edna, Miss Marple said, smiling. Just leave it. There. Our guest will be arriving any moment. Indeed, even before the girl had left the room, there came a knock at the front door. It was Inspector Craddock. He entered with a look that suggested he was not quite sure whether he was there for tea or a cross-examination. But Miss Marple welcomed him with the same calm civility with which she received the vicar or Mrs. Price Ridley. Do sit down, dear Inspector. I thought it best we speak plainly before any further steps are taken. Craddock accepted the tea. You mean before an arrest? Yes. She stirred her cup slowly. It's all really very simple, but only when you look at it sideways. He raised an eyebrow. Is that how you've managed it, then? Solved the whole affair by looking sideways? Miss Marple gave a modest smile. One must never look directly at things. People hide behind appearances, but the side view, the unguarded moment, reveals far more. He leaned forward slightly. Well then, Miss Marple, tell me, who killed the woman calling herself Violette Marsh? Miss Marple set down her teacup with a soft clink. It was Mrs. Edith Hargreaves, she said, and I believe she had help, whether witting or not, from Lady Carrington. Craddock inhaled sharply, but Miss Marple continued before he could interrupt. It began years ago, you see, with a child, Edith's child, born in secrecy, passed off through quiet channels. The real Violette Marsh died, quite young, in a seaside boarding house. But the opportunity was there. A young woman who had vanished from the family's view. A convenient cousin. A modest fortune. And Edith helped someone, her own daughter I suspect, step into the role. She created a new identity, Craddock murmured. Yes. And then came the return to Greystone Manor. Lady Carrington, I think, realized the truth. Too late to stop it, but early enough to understand what it meant. The girl, her supposed niece, had charm and nerve, but not caution. She began to uncover old secrets. She confronted Mrs. Hargreaves. She wrote 2 letters, one to a solicitor, and another, I believe, to Lady Carrington herself. She intended to tell the truth, but someone else got there first. Craddock frowned. The poisoned drink? Miss Marple nodded. At the tea-room, Mrs. Hargreaves tampered with the lemon curd, intending to frighten or silence the girl. But the meeting never happened. So the poison was used later, perhaps in a glass of cordial at the manor. But the woman had already begun to unravel the entire affair. The stair, the lipstick, the letter, and so she had to be silenced. Craddock sat back, staring at her. But why now? Why would Mrs. Hargreaves act with such desperation? Because the woman posing as Violette was no longer content to keep quiet. She had guilt, perhaps, or conscience. And when she found the lipstick, Edith's old silver case, hidden in the 3rd stair, she began to suspect the truth of her own origin, that she had been raised in a lie, that she was not the victim, but the accomplice. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice lower now. And then came the ruined pudding at the fete. Not an accident, a warning. To someone. And the arrival of Mrs. Millicent Grey, who knew the real Violette Marsh and realized at once the girl here was an imposter. That visit was the final straw. Craddock rubbed his chin. So Mrs. Hargreaves burned the letter to hide the evidence, and in doing so, made her panic known. Miss Marple reached into the drawer of her side table and produced a sheet of writing paper, faintly singed at the edges, but still legible. I retrieved this from the grate before the fire had burned it fully. It's the 2nd letter, the one that was never meant to be seen. She handed it to Craddock, who read silently. His expression hardened. She was confessing, he said at last. Not just about the identity, but about Mrs. Hargreaves. She planned to expose her as well. Yes, said Miss Marple gently, and that is what cost her her life. The room was quiet for a moment, save for the ticking of the ormolu clock. Then Craddock stood. I'll have to bring her in. Yes, said Miss Marple, but I suggest you do so with kindness. It was a dreadful crime, yes, but also the desperate end to a long, sad deception. A mother protecting a child she never should have lost. A child raised in falsehood, punished for wanting to tell the truth. Craddock hesitated, then nodded slowly. You always see them, don't you? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I've lived long enough to know that murder rarely begins with hate. More often it starts with love. Misguided, secretive, unforgiving love. Outside, the bells of St. Mary Mead struck 4. Miss Marple reached once more for her teacup, and quietly, unceremoniously, sipped, and so the mystery came to a close, not with a grand revelation, shouted from the rooftop of Greystone Manor, but with the quiet conviction of truth laid bare. The village sighed back into its rhythm. The gossip shifted from speculation to retelling, and Miss Marple's roses, as always, bloomed with exquisite timing, utterly unconcerned with the darker blossoms of human nature they so often accompanied